So here's Henry VIII again. As we heard last quarter, back in the 16th century, when Henry, as an ally of the Pope, was planning to invade France to force Louis XII to pull his army out of Italy, Henry arranged the marriage of his sister Margaret to James IV of Scotland. Henry's idea was to try to keep the Scots from taking advantage of his absence in France, but didn't work. As soon as he was across the Channel, brother-in-law though he was, James IV came down across the Tweed bent on making trouble in England. Luckily for Henry, however, he had left the Earl of Surrey on the lookout for just such misbehavior by the weasel Scots, as Henry called them. And at the Battle of Flodden Field, and you see the field of Flodden here now, in 1513, the Scots were defeated by Surrey and James IV was killed. And at his death then, James V, his infant son by Margaret, became the nominal king of Scotland. About a year after the death of James IV, she married Archibald Douglas, the Earl of Angus. And since Angus was looked upon as a friend of Henry's, this was thought to bode well for England. This is Falkland Palace, mostly built by James IV and James V. It's about 40 miles north of Edinburgh. As it turned out, however, Margaret and Angus grew to hate each other, and James V's youth was filled with confinements here or there by the partisans, now of one side, now of the other. For a couple of years, he was held here by Angus, who professed to rule in his name, until James escaped at the age of 16 and rode to Stirling, where his mother was, and where he was acknowledged as king in his own right, and Angus fled to England to the protection of his friend Henry. Not surprisingly, James V wanted nothing to do with an English marriage, and he married first Madeline, the sister of Henry II of France, and after she died almost immediately, he then, in 1538, wed Marie de Guise, the sister of the very influential Francois de Guise, about whom we've heard as a leader on the Catholic side in the French Wars of Religion. This is a portrait now of Marie de Guise. Like her brother and most of the Guises, she was very tall, and her daughter Mary, known as Mary Queen of Scots, of course, will grow to be nearly 6 feet tall, making her one of the tallest women in the country. When Queen Elizabeth was told how tall Mary was, that Mary was much taller than she was, she is said to have remarked, "Then she's too tall." This marriage was doubly irritating to Henry. First, because it made the Franco-Scottish alliance closer, and secondly, because he'd hoped to marry Marie de Guise himself. It's very unlikely she would have married Henry in any case, considering the fact that the Guises were about the most fervent Catholics on the planet, and Henry's only real religion was power and politics. Stranger marriages have taken place, but Henry probably never had any real chance. Marie de Guise gave birth to the future Mary Queen of Scots at Linlithgow, west of Edinburgh, on December 7, 1542. The occasion of Mary's birth did not fall in a very happy period, though, for the Scots. The birth of Mary took place, as I say, on December 7th. On the 24th of November, James's army had been badly defeated. Her father James V's army had been badly defeated by the English at Solway Moss, even though the latter were heavily outnumbered. James himself was ill and not present, but he lost most of his best friends and sank into a depression from which he never really recovered, dying at Falkland just a week after the birth of his daughter Mary. Mary was Queen of Scots at the age of 1 week. If you're looking for causes for all the troubles the Scots had in the 15th and 16th centuries, it's worth noticing that of the 7 rulers in a row which Scotland had from James II to James VI, not one took the throne as an adult. The political and personal squabbling of regents and wannabe regents certainly made it difficult to maintain any national momentum, and it's amazing that Scotland managed to stay independent of England as long as it did. We're going to see the romantic ruin of Linlithgow and hear one of the finest Scottish songs, written at this time. It's called Depart, Depart, and it was written by Robert Erskine, who had a crush on Marie de Guise and was killed at the Battle of Pinkie, about which we'll hear in just a few minutes. This is the courtyard of Linlithgow, and you can see the fountain which James V gave to Marie de Guise as a wedding present there. And a view of the lake from the castle now.
What chance that may fall in some there meeting unto the day.
And this is Pinkie Cleuch, or just Pinkie, east of Edinburgh, where Erskine was killed in 1547. The second Earl of Arran, great-grandson of James II and next in line to the throne, was appointed regent, and he arranged a deal with Henry to have Mary sent to England at the age of 10, preparatory to her agreed-upon marriage to Henry's son Edward. Marie de Guise and her supporters, who favored a French alliance, refused to go along with this, however, and the infuriated Henry sent the Earl of Hertford with an army to enforce his will and ideally to get possession of little Mary. This resulted in the Battle of Pinkie, fought here, as I say, in 1547, in which Hertford defeated the Scots, and in which Erskine was killed. But Mary was hidden away on the island of Inchmahome, west of Stirling in Lake Menteith.
But this may heritage come forever and day. Then it may spring to the light from the sweet.
To keep her away from the English, her mother then arranged for her to be taken to France. She was still just about 6 and raised there while betrothed to Henry II and Catherine de' Medici's oldest son, Francis. Henry VIII died the same year, 1547, which made the English threat temporarily less serious, but Marie made what must have been a very hard decision, to let her daughter remain in France, and she never saw her again. In 1554, Arran resigned the regency in favor of Marie, who then, according to most historians, did about as good a job as probably anyone could have done, trying to uphold her daughter's rights in Scotland, while faced with mounting opposition from Protestant and English forces. Many Protestants began to find the English more appealing than Marie and her Catholic French connections, and shortly after her death in 1560, the Scottish Parliament, under the influence of John Knox, made the practice of Catholicism in Scotland illegal. We'll hear more about him shortly. This is an anonymous portrait of Mary, done in France and now at Chantilly. All the portraits of Mary that survive were probably painted in France. The Scots had no painters of consequence. So Mary spent her formative years in France then, and in 1558, at the age of 16, she was married to the Dauphin, the heir to the French throne, who was a year younger. As we've heard, her father-in-law, Francis's father, Henry II, was killed in the tournament in the Rue Saint-Antoine in 1559, which made Francis and Mary king and queen of France, but then shortly after the tumult of Amboise, he died. This is another portrait of Mary attributed to Francois Clouet. Here she's wearing what's known as white mourning in honor of either her father-in-law or her husband or both. Ronsard, in a poem about her, says, "Just as half rosy and half white, dawn and the morning star dispel the night, thus in beauty beyond compare impearled, Mary Stuart rises on the world." She learned to spell her name Stuart in France, and that's the way the Stuarts often spelled it after her return and after they went on to rule England. After the death of Francis, Mary's position in France became complicated. She probably could have just married someone like Marie Chevalier, Charles Boyer, and settled down to chateau life on the Loire. But Catherine de Medici was to some extent jealous of her, and her connection through her mother to the Guises, who were fast becoming as powerful as the royal family itself. In any case, Mary did, of course, decide to return to Scotland. This decision has to be considered a little puzzling, though, at least. She was almost entirely French in upbringing. Her mother was no longer alive in Scotland. She hadn't seen the place since she was 6. And it was dominated, Scotland now, by people who considered Catholics like herself to be at best misguided tools of the devil Pope, and who were themselves considered by the French Catholics anyway, to be artless and cultureless barbarians under the spell of the devil preacher John Knox. This is still another portrait of Mary attributed to Clouet. Some think that Mary thought that in going to Edinburgh she was on the road to London. In the eyes of Catholics, Elizabeth was an illegitimate Protestant and not entitled to the throne of England at all. And Mary was next in line by blood and was both legitimate and Catholic. The thought that she might be closer to the throne of England as Mary Queen of Scots than as Mary ex-Queen of France may certainly have been a part of her decision. But the bottom line, I think, is that she just found it hard to give up being a queen, even if in being Queen of Scotland she would be in a very difficult position. In 1561, at the age of 19, she did arrive back in Edinburgh. This is an anonymous portrait of Mary's older half-brother now, James Stuart, the Earl of Murray, the moderate Protestant who became her chief advisor on her return. One thing the return of Mary Queen of Scots shows, I think, is just how deeply the idea that hereditary monarchy was the natural form of government was ingrained in everyone. No one, probably not even Murray himself, had considered putting him on the throne instead of Mary, even though he was no less than she, the child of James V, and he was a man and he was older. He was, however, illegitimate, and the Protestants, no less than the Catholics, drew the line at that. Because of her legitimate blood connection, Mary, who hadn't seen Scotland in years, was of the wrong religion, and a woman besides, was still considered the rightful ruler. She did, however, agree to smooth her return, to practice her faith only in private, and to make no attempt to proselytize or reconvert Scotland. And, too, her first important action as queen somewhat quieted her Protestant critics when she sent James here with an army to suppress the rebellion of the Catholic Gordons, though many, like Knox, remained unimpressed. This is the ruin of the Castle of St. Andrews now, north of Edinburgh. Back in 1546, when Knox was a Catholic priest, Cardinal Beaton, the Archbishop of St. Andrews, who had been Marie de Guise's staunch ally in trying to hold to the French and Catholic alliance, had a Protestant preacher named George Wishart burned at the stake. In revenge, Beaton's castle here was stormed and occupied by Protestants, and he was killed. Knox, who had already met and been influenced by Wishart, eventually joined the rebels, and when a French force arrived to take back the castle, he was captured with many of the other Protestants and imprisoned in France. After about 2 years, he was released, apparently as a result of the intercession of Edward VI, which seems odd. He then came and went from England and Scotland for several years as politics and religion dictated. working in a couple of visits to Geneva to see John Calvin, by whom he was to be decisively influenced. Finally, in 1559, Knox arrived back in Edinburgh for good and lived in this house on High Street. For the next 2 years, he was deeply involved in the politico-religious struggle to resist the French and strengthen the Protestant cause. And when Mary arrived, she certainly considered him one of her chief enemies. Knox may have made less fuss than one might expect over her return, out of the mistaken belief that she, a mere teenage girl, would be easy to push around. Several meetings of, however, decreasing cordiality took place between them soon after her arrival. We have only Knox's side of what went on in these meetings, but most historians think the accounts are likely reasonably accurate. They do present an interesting picture: the beautiful teenage queen and the grizzled fire and brimstone preacher arguing over politics and theology. This is a modern statue of Knox. His religion aside, the fact that he had described women as weak, impatient, foolish, and unfit to rule in a book called The Monstrous Regiment of Women didn't do anything to make him seem more congenial to Mary, I'm sure. According to his own History of the Reformation in Scotland, when she questioned his loyalty at one of these meetings they had, he famously remarked that he would remain as content to live under her rule as Paul had been to live under Nero. On one occasion, he accused her of being more interested in fiddling and flinging than in hearing God's blessed word, and he said that she valued fiddlers and flatterers more than men, presumably like himself, of wisdom and gravity, who might beat down some part of that vanity whereunto all are born, but which in princes takes deep root by wicked education. Knox said the queen replied, "If you hear anything of me that you don't like, come to me and tell me, and I will hear you." To which he responded, "I am called, madam, to a public function within the Kirk of God, and was appointed by God to rebuke the sins and vices of all. I'm not appointed to come to every man in particular. That labor were infinite. If your grace would be pleased to frequent the public sermons, then I doubt not but ye shall fully understand what I like and what I don't like." This is the way the Church of St. Giles looks today in the middle of High Street in Edinburgh, where Knox gave his sermons. In 1559, it had been taken over by Knox, and all the paintings, altarpieces, statues, and relics were thrown into Loch Nor. Up to about 1563, Mary's half-brother, the Earl of Murray, had more or less supported her against Knox, but when it became clear that she planned to marry a Catholic, perhaps even Philip II's son Don Carlos, he opposed this no less than Knox. I might mention that Knox's own marriage at 55 to a 17-year-old girl who was in fact a distant relative of Mary's didn't pass without some comment in Protestant circles either. This is the interior of St. Giles, and you can see another statue of Knox there. Although marrying Don Carlos would have been political, if not actual, suicide for Mary, when she became attracted to the 19-year-old Catholic Henry Stuart Lord Darnley, many thought this little better as an option. There's some disagreement about just when he arrived in Scotland from England, where he'd been living in exile, but he apparently came down with measles at Stirling, and Mary nursed him through this, and there may have been a secret marriage there, although the official marriage didn't take place until July of 1565 at Holyrood Palace in Edinburgh.
Yonder comes a courteous knight, lustily raking o'er the lea. He was well aware of our bonny lass, as she...
This is an anonymous portrait of Henry Stuart Lord Darnley now with his younger brother Charles. In addition to the fact that he was a Catholic of the right age, he was also good-looking and very tall, apparently about 6'2". He was undoubtedly the only suitor for Mary's hand who was actually taller than she was. She referred to him as the best-looking long man she'd ever seen.
So green, if I were a king and wore a crown.
Queen Elizabeth officially protested against the marriage. It united two people who had good claims on her throne. They were both great-grandchildren of Henry VII and shared a common grandmother in Henry VIII's sister Margaret. But some think Elizabeth actually was in favor of it because she knew what a jerk Darnley was. He would, this theory goes, be a sort of time bomb that would wreck Mary's position. If Elizabeth really thought this way, it's an outstanding example of her well-known political acumen, because almost immediately Darnley proved to be a terrible husband and a political liability of the first magnitude.
Then she sang down, down, hey, down, Terry.
This is Stirling Castle, where Mary nursed and loved Darnley in early 1565, one of the most historically evocative places in Scotland. We saw a little of it last quarter when I was talking about Robert the Bruce and the Battle of Bannockburn, which took place within sight of it. As it stands, it was mostly built by Mary's father and grandfather, James V and IV. As I mentioned above, Murray was very much opposed to this marriage, and Mary herself led the troops which forced the recalcitrant Murray and his friends to retreat over the border into England, an event which did much to enhance the reputation she's always had in some quarters as a courageous and heroic figure, a reputation, though, that has to be balanced, however, by her bad judgment in falling in love with Darnley.
Then she sang down,
Here's a closer view of it, more or less from the southeast, with the big towers of the gatehouse that actually go back to James III's day. Darnley proved charming to almost no one in Scotland except Mary, and it wasn't long before she herself had to recognize that he was a seriously flawed young man. He was rude, arrogant, self-indulgent, and stupid. What he wanted more than anything was the crown matrimonial, royal rights equal to Mary's, and not less important, the right to keep the throne should anything happen to Mary. To her credit, this is one thing she did refuse him, reducing him to fits of whiny petulance. This room at Stirling is referred to as Mary's. One of Mary's closest associates was an Italian musician named David Riccio, who also served as something like her secretary. The Protestants regarded him as a spy from the Pope, and Darnley too seems to have believed that he and Mary were spending more time together in private than his job description warranted. In any case, Darnley made a deal with some of the leading Protestants to allow Murray and some of the others kicked out by Mary, as I mentioned earlier, to return and to respect the Protestant faith, and they in turn would recognize his right to the crown matrimonial and conspire with him to kill Riccio, whom both Darnley and the Protestants wanted to get rid of.
you might have your will of me, for in good face I never said nay.
This is Holyrood Palace now at Edinburgh, at the other end of High Street from the castle. The abbey, the ruins of which still survive behind the palace, was founded by David I back in the 12th century. The palace on the grounds was begun by Mary's grandfather James IV and completed by her father James V, but about all that survives of the original work is the section in the foreground in this picture. Outside the wall of the city, it was burned down in the 1540s when the English were attacking. Rebuilt, it was more or less the default residence of Mary, though much of the place would now be unfamiliar to her since it is today mostly 17th century. It is today also the official residence of the Queen in Edinburgh. One very important room which does survive in this foreground section is the so-called audience chamber where Mary had her interviews with Knox, and where on March 9th, 1566, Riccio was murdered. This was Mary's apartment in the palace, and on the night Riccio was killed, they were having dinner in the room through the open door at the back. The assassins, led by the Earl of Morton, barged in and dragged him into this room and then out through the door to the right. The bronze plaque on the floor marks the spot where Riccio is supposed to have fallen. he was struck down in her presence by James Douglas, the 3rd Earl of Morton, and several other men, and Darnley's dagger was left sticking in his body, although he was not one of the actual murderers. Mary was 6 months pregnant at the time with the future James VI, and some believe that it was hoped that she might die of some complication brought on by this trauma, miscarriage or whatever, and Darnley would probably not have been sorry if Mary had accidentally been struck down in the fray, since having been promised the crown matrimonial, this would have made him, theoretically at least, King of Scotland in his own right. This is Craigmillar Castle, just southeast of Edinburgh, which was also a favourite residence of Mary. It was soon after the murder of Riccio that James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, began to play a large part in Mary's life. They had first met when she was Queen of France, and she had looked favourably upon a request he made for some money at the time because he was one of the most important Protestants in Scotland who was supportive of her mother, Marie de Guise. When after Riccio's murder, and what it must have told her about her husband, she began to look for help in other quarters, Bothwell came forward. By the end of the year, they were apparently lovers. And in February 1567, Bothwell and several others agreed here to plot to kill Darnley so that Bothwell could marry Mary. The idea was apparently to blow Darnley up in a house where he was staying about a mile from Holyrood. But at the last minute he got out. The place went up in a huge explosion, but he was apparently caught outside and strangled by the conspirators. This is his home, known as Hermitage Castle in the Lowlands, not far from the English border. Bothwell was sort of the first real man in Mary's life. Her first husband, Francis, had died while still in his teens, and Darnley had behaved more like a baby than a grown man and was only 21 when he was killed. Bothwell was 32 and had lived a life of warfare and adventure, and now divorced his wife on grounds that she had committed adultery so that he would be free to wed Mary. Cecil, Queen Elizabeth's secretary, called him as naughty a man as there is living. This is another view of Hermitage Castle. Naughty or not, he and Mary were married at Holyrood in May 1567 in a Protestant ceremony. This met with almost universal condemnation right up to the Pope himself, and their honeymoon was short. They retreated to Borthwick Castle here, southeast of Edinburgh, one of the most well-preserved 15th century buildings in Scotland. But here they were besieged by the Earl of Morton, the same who had murdered Riccio and who was probably also involved with Bothwell in the murder of Darnley and other insurgents. But Bothwell escaped, and Mary was able later to sneak out and rejoin him at Dunbar on the coast, which is now a ruin. From here they hoped to be able to return to Edinburgh, but were met at Carberry Hill, east of Edinburgh, by Morton and the rebel army. Bothwell proposed to return to Dunbar and gather more men, but she never saw him again. She was taken prisoner by Morton, and Bothwell fled to Denmark, where he died in prison. Knox called for her immediate execution, but Mary was placed under house arrest at Lochleven Castle here in Lochleven, north of Edinburgh near Falkland. The place was owned by Morton's cousin, William Douglas, who was also Murray's half-brother. Early in her captivity here, she miscarried stillborn twins, presumably by Bothwell. In July of 1567, about a month after her captivity, she abdicated here, leaving the throne to her infant son by Darnley, James VI, for whom her half-brother Murray was then appointed regent. This is another view of the castle ruin on the island, Lochleven. It must have been thought by Morton, Murray, and the other rebels that this was a safe place to keep Mary, but George Douglas, William Douglas's younger brother, and a distant orphan relative, Willie Douglas, were won over in secret by Mary and helped her to escape in May of 1568. The small force which she was able to gather was, however, defeated by Morton and Murray at Langside near Glasgow, and she fled with the Douglases across the border to Carlisle Castle in England. This is the so-called ermine portrait of Mary's cousin once removed, Queen Elizabeth. What Mary wanted was for Elizabeth to let her go to France, but Elizabeth understandably was not so inclined. She did apparently send a promise to help Mary, but this was soon in effect taken to mean that she would help her if certain conditions could be met. In particular, there had to be an investigation into the authenticity of the so-called casket letters, which were alleged by Murray, who presented them to Elizabeth to implicate Mary in the murder of Darnley. This is thought to be the actual casket in which the casket letters were kept, but the originals no longer exist. The commission appointed to look into them reached no decision about their content, although Elizabeth herself did say that the evidence that was presented to the commission was enough to justify Mary's continued imprisonment. However, it's hard to imagine that Elizabeth would have just let Mary go, even if she thought she had had no part in the murder of Darnley. The casket letters were just a convenient excuse. Almost certainly some other excuse would have been found to keep Mary locked up, even if there never even been any casket letters. The bottom line, the truth is that Mary was an accessory to the murder of Darnley. The casket letters proved nothing, and Mary was locked up simply because she was a threat to Elizabeth. And as many of those around her were not slow to point out, she was almost as much of a threat even in captivity. Cecil and others urged Elizabeth, sometimes on an almost daily basis for 19 years, to execute her. Mary was really in a no-win situation. There was nothing she could say or do that would make her less of a threat. Nothing she could say or do she couldn't take back if Philip II overthrew Elizabeth and offered to put her on the throne. If you want to read the casket letters, incidentally, they're reprinted in Antonia Fraser's very good biography of Mary. This is Hardwicke Hall, one of the most well-preserved of all Elizabethan buildings, and the property of George Talbot, Earl of Shrewsbury, the man who was Mary's custodian for much of her captivity, though she was never kept here. Most of the places where Mary was actually kept, various other homes owned by the wealthy Earl, no longer exist, at least in a form that would be familiar to Mary. Why Shrewsbury was chosen for this job isn't exactly clear, but obviously Elizabeth thought him loyal, and he was, although he was sometimes thought to be showing his important prisoner too much leniency. It must have crossed his mind more than once that it was still possible, if Elizabeth should die, that Mary would become Queen of England, and it would then do him much more good to be remembered as a friend than as a jailer. This is another view of Hardwicke, and you can see at the top the initials E.S., which don't stand for Earl of Shrewsbury, but rather for Elizabeth of Shrewsbury, his famous wife, who was in fact the real builder of Hardwicke and probably the wealthiest woman in England apart from Elizabeth herself. Shrewsbury was in fact her fourth husband, and the way in which she survived and profited from her husbands inspired a popular ditty by Horace Walpole later that ran, "4 times the nuptial bed she warmed, and each time so well performed, that when death spoiled each husband's billing, he left the widow every shilling." This is a portrait of Bess of Hardwicke, as she was known. Her second marriage was to William Cavendish, and they had several important children and descendants who were heads and members of some of the greatest families in England. The Dukes of Devonshire are among the most important, and this branch of the family still owns Chatsworth, which the first Duke, Bess's great-great-grandson built, and which we'll see next quarter. The 11th Duke was known in the Bay Area here as the brother-in-law of the late Jessica Mitford, whose sister was his wife. His brother married the future President Kennedy's sister Kathleen and was killed in the Allied invasion of Normandy. Bess's relationships with her husband, Mary, and Elizabeth were all rocky. At first she seems to have enjoyed visiting Mary and embroidering with her and things like that, but she became jealous of the time her husband spent with his charming prisoner and eventually accused him of adultery with her. She also angered both her husband and Elizabeth by arranging a marriage between her daughter and Charles Stuart, the brother of Darnley. This caused Elizabeth to briefly place her under house arrest in the Tower. Bess's granddaughter by this marriage, Arabella Stuart, was to be viewed as a dangerous rival by Mary's son James after he became King of England, and after an adventurous life she was imprisoned in the Tower by him and died there. This is the Great Hall at Hardwicke now. Hardwicke has belonged to the National Trust since the 1950s and is of course open to the public. Shrewsbury was replaced as Mary's custodian in 1584, partly because the threats of Catholic plots to free Mary were growing in seriousness, and it was apparently felt by Elizabeth that custodians of a more Puritan background would be more vigilant. Also by that time, Bess and Shrewsbury and Mary were involved in such an imbroglio of accusations and counter-accusations that Elizabeth probably just thought the general situation of her Shrewsbury custodianship was just too messy. We're going to see a little more of Hardwicke now as it looks today, which is to a large extent the way it looked 400 years ago, although much of the actual furniture was acquired by later members of the family. And while we're inside now here at Hardwicke, we're going to hear a piece of music by William Byrd, a harpsichord piece. He was, you may remember from last quarter, actually the Catholic organist for Elizabeth's own Protestant service. The fact that he was Catholic didn't, in her eyes, disqualify him from playing the organ in her service, and obviously he was willing to go along with this too. This is the Green Velvet Room, named after the 18th century bed there, which was acquired by the 6th Duke. This is the Long Gallery, which is the largest Elizabethan one surviving and is also unique in having still the original 16th century tapestries and many of the paintings hung on them, which were there in Bess's day. This is the High Great Chamber, considered the finest room in the house. Bess bought the tapestries here in 1587, and the painted plaster frieze up above there was done about the same time. It tells the story of Diana the Huntress. The most famous piece of furniture in the house is the walnut sea dog table in the withdrawing room, which some think was a gift to Bess from either Mary or Elizabeth. This is the so-called Mary Queen of Scots room at Hardwicke, although as I said she was almost certainly never here. The panel over the door was brought from Chatsworth. It has her coat of arms on it, where she did spend a lot of time, however. And here's another view of Hardwicke from outside. Here's another portrait of Mary in the collection of the Alba family in Madrid. As I said, there were many plots to free Mary: the Ridolfi plot, the Throckmorton plot, the Parry plot, and finally the Babington plot of 1586. Anthony Babington organized a conspiracy to kill Elizabeth, the usurper as she was regarded, and coordinate this with an invasion of England by a Spanish army and the establishment of Mary on her rightful throne. This was obviously a harebrained scheme, but Mary, desperate after 18 years of captivity, gave her consent to the overall plan in a letter which was to be delivered to Babington by a man trusted by her secretary, a man who was actually, however, an agent of Sir Francis Walsingham, the head of Elizabeth's equivalent to the FBI. Babington and several others who were alleged to be conspirators were arrested and executed, and serious pressure was then put on Elizabeth to execute Mary herself. She was transferred to Fotheringay Castle, which her son James VI of Scotland, James I of England later raised, and tried by a court of 43 nobles who unanimously condemned her to death in 1587. Despite Mary's admission of support for the plot, while denying that she agreed to the murder of Elizabeth, for what that lame claim would have been worth, Elizabeth was reluctant to sign the death warrant. At first she tried to get Amias Paulet, Mary's guardian, to order the execution on a verbal understanding that that's what the Queen wanted, but he refused to do anything without written orders. Finally it was decided, apparently on the Queen's own suggestion, that Davison, her council secretary, would place the warrant in a stack of routine papers she had to sign, and in that way it could later be denied that she had actually meant to do it, for what that lame claim would be worth. To the last, Elizabeth apparently really did hope that some devoted subject would just kill Mary and relieve her of the responsibility. Indeed, after Mary's execution, Elizabeth did arrest Davison, but he was freed after her private secretary Cecil made it clear to her that she was acting like a fool. Mary's body was brought from Fotheringay to Westminster by her son James after he became king. He, however, made no attempts to forestall her execution, realizing that if he played his cards right and kept his mouth shut, he would be the next king of England. And in fact, he had not seen his mother since he was 2. This is the room in Edinburgh Castle where James VI and First was born, and we'll hear about him and about Charles I and Cromwell and about the greatest century in the history of English literature next time.